Dear participants, good morning and welcome to our session, group session regarding digital finance, how to deal with the future of service delivery and innovative products. I am Camilla, and I am Camilla Teresa, and I'm a training consultant with IPC, and I will monitor the session until the end of the presentation. Many thanks for providing your sessions by clicking on live discussion at the bottom right of your screen. I will now give the floor to our speaker for this session, Christophe Bretagnol, who is the managing partner of at PCES, Process Crafting and Services. And Christophe has more than 20 years experience in the IT sector, and for the last 10 years, he also supports some financial institutions in Africa and the IT process. Good morning, Christophe. Good morning, Camilla. Many thanks. Many thanks also to you all for taking part in this digital finance session. I think that we will have a very interesting discussion, and therefore we will talk today about digital finance with a main guide, which is to give you the right tools, the right essential elements in order to navigate through this particular complicated topic, which is digital finance for many of us. As Camilla has stated to start with, we will have a Q&A sessions at the end of the presentation, and we will also ask you a few questions through some poll questions in order to also gather your impressions about digital finance and see what are the topics that you're most interested in. So, as I stated earlier on, we will talk about a guide, a digital finance guide, if I may say so. We will first start by talking about the digital world as a whole. What is the current situation and why is digital important? Is it really important for financial institutions? We will also talk about the institution itself. How can the institution become a digital institution? What are the important things to bear in mind? What are the difficulties we might encounter? We will then talk quite generally about the digital ecosystem. How can we organize the digital ecosystem with various stakeholders and various tools? And we will then afterwards get further and deeper into the details with three of these elements. The first one that I talked, the digital essence, which really are the data. At what point are these data important? What do we need to consider when we are looking at this data? And also, how can we integrate this within your digital strategy? Then we will talk about the digital channels. As you know, this is something that is very much on point. It's a trend that we speak a lot about currently, because it's a means to contact your client and to have a means of contacting your clients in a very, very close proximity. And so therefore we'll talk about the digital channels, what are the advantages and the disadvantages, and finally what I will call the digital wildlife. This is like a digital jungle in a way, and what are the different software, what are the different institutions that have been set up around this digital finance sector in order to be able to create this ecosystem that is a little complex, this digital ecosystem. So we will start with the digital world, and in order to start on this particular topic, I want to ask you a particular question. So you will have a poll question appearing on your screen. That's what we plan to do. And the question is, for your institution, what does digital consist of? One of the many projects that you have to accomplish, amongst many, but maybe not important than other projects? Is it rather a trend that will come and go at some stage? Many people talk about this. A number of things take place around this, but yet this is a temporary trend. Or is it a difficulty that is difficult to grasp, and yet it is a reality for many of you? It's something quite complex, as we will cover later on. Or is it an essential element of your commercial strategy? And is it something that to you is very important and that has already been integrated within your institution? So you will be able to answer this poll question with the question appearing on your screen, and then we will be able to carry on with the digital world. So, I had asked the question, but it's clear that to me, and I think for many of you too, the digital revolution is something that has really taken quite a place in your everyday life and within the strategies that you might implement, and it is something that has become an important part of how to think about finance today, in today's world. And I had placed an answer in a way as a little bit of a trap when I was asking you if it was a trend as such, simply because, as we can see with the figures that we have on the screen, just a few numbers to show you an idea of the volumes we're talking about and the progression over the last few years. And therefore, as you can see on the graphs, when we start from 1996 until 2018, we can see the progression of the internet access for your clients, and we can see that this does keeps on increasing, and it's not about it. It will not slow down anytime soon, and we can see that in the developed world, even if that increase has slowed down a little, this is simply because we are now having quite high levels of equipment, but in some countries where the levels of equipment is below 50%, this level is still increasing at a rapid pace. So the access to internet is something that these days is completely integral to everybody's everyday life, the same as mobile telephones. I did not want to put too many graphs on the screen so as not to overload you, but yet I'm certain that you're very much aware of the fact that the mobile telephone penetration is very important too, and it participates in a very significant way to that development of the internet access. So the internet access, which offers, especially through mobile phones, offers many possibilities in order to be able to contact your clients. So we have already received the result from the poll, and almost 90% of you in the audience consider that the digital world is an essential part of your strategy, which I think really reveals the importance of these particular topics in the everyday life of the institutions. And as you can see on the graph on the right, you can see the evolution of the transactions which are carried out through digital means, and you can see this increase, which also is really significant, and this is not something that is about to be a trend just for a little while, but rather a lasting tendency, and we cannot allow ourselves as a financial institution to simply consider this as something that we must do now, but that will not have an impact on the long-term basis on the institutions, simply because, as you can see, it's not as if people were using their mobile phones less and less. In fact, they're used more and more. Access to internet is more and more considered almost as a human right, and there are a number of discussions and talks talking about this in this manner. So really, we are talking about a revolution that will have a deep impact on a long-term basis on the institutions. So we will talk about the institutions and how this change requires a profound and deeper remodeling of the institutions, reshaping of the institutions, simply because this is something to be considered on the long-term basis. It's not just a simple add-on that we must have somewhere where we will give to your IT staff, let's go digital, and then that's it, it's done, and we can get on with the rest of activities. However, it's something that must be intrinsically embedded within the institution. So How can we push this digital part to be more integrated in the institutions? This is with a view that considers the technology simply as the last point of the implementation of the digital side. I had many cases where I see some clients who start by the technology saying, oh, well, we want some mobile wallet, or we want some banking agents, or we want some mobile banking. And therefore, they have this approach to say, right, we want this particular technology, and now we will develop a strategy around the fact that we want to use this technology because everybody has this particular technology. But it's not because a particular technology has been well applied by one of your competitors that it will necessarily, or by some institutions that were not your concurrents to start with, or your competitors to start with, for example, the mobile service suppliers, but rather this must be something coming out of your reflection and thinking from the institution. So on a strategic level, to start with, you must always consider the business strategy first and foremost, and then add a strategic positioning about how the institution wants to position itself in a technological fashion. Does the institution want to be seen as being innovators, leading the way with the most advanced product and the latest products available, which can be quite tempting. We might tell ourselves that we really need to be innovative, but especially for banks or for the finance sector, it's not something that will necessarily be the most adapted to your own positioning and your own positioning of your institution. There are some institutions which are considered, especially in the banking sector, as institutions which are rather focused on security and safety, or rather focused on the fact that we have a technology, but yet this technology has been proven time and time again rather than innovative technology. So you need to decide on your positioning regarding this, and then decide on your strategy and the technology, in knowing that you want to use technology to serve your clients and using technology that have been proven time and time again, rather than just chasing the latest technology. Or you have to decide, we want to be a very innovative bank on the online bank world, with some online banks who are really positioned with innovation at the forefront of their mind. Or you can decide to have a positioning which is not necessarily that of online banks, but rather traditional banks, and yet they have positioned themselves with mobile elements and so forth. So it's important to bear all these elements in mind in order to be able to develop a business and a commercial strategy that will correspond to what you're after. And then you need to think from that strategy what products you will want to set up and implement, principally acted on the client's needs and commercial goals. I have also seen in my career many times some clients from institutions who have this particular idea to say, oh, well, we want to implement, for example, mobile wallet. It's a product that comes back in the conversations time and again, because otherwise our clients will leave us and go to the mobile suppliers. But yet, this is not really the needs of your clients. Sometimes, if your clients, for example, need to get access to cash, then this is an issue that could be solved differently. So really the best way forward is to establish what your clients' needs are in a very detailed manner, so that afterwards, according to this particular commercial goals, you could define some products that would really be adapted to what your clients require and your clients' needs, because there are so many products, especially with the digital world. You have many products being set up, many new channels being set up, but yet it does not mean that you need to have absolutely everything, especially as it's often quite difficult to do everything at once, which is oftentimes what institutions want. They want everything all at once because they feel they are left behind otherwise, and they feel that if they do not set up all of these products, then they will not manage to keep their clients, whilst quite often these products or these distribution channels or quite redundant, and they resolve the same client needs. So therefore, you need to follow an approach where you really prioritize your client's needs in order to then be able to go to the final step. And the final step, the final phase, is the phase where you will now choose the technology that will meet your client's needs. So when I'm talking about products, I'm talking about products for the clients, but behind the products, you also have everything to do with the internal side that needs to be considered within the institutions in order to be able to manage these new distribution channels. And that's why under the technology side, I've also put software which will enable you to absorb the volume generated by these distribution channels. One thing that is often overlooked is wanting to have new distribution channels without necessarily having digitalized internally, which means that the new flux brought by these distribution channels doesn't get absorbed as well as it could internally by the institution in order to be able to deal with all these new cases, all these new requests coming from the clients, because it's very difficult to plan, or rather to think ahead, especially when we are using some new technologies not present in the country. It's very difficult to judge the client's reactions, and sometimes we could have some results that could really go way beyond the expectations, which then can create its own problems, especially as in the digital world, as the offer is very important. It is very difficult to have a client which, once they have tested your technology and it doesn't work as that client was expecting, it would then be very difficult to get that client back on this particular channel. So therefore, you always need to favor an implementation, a solid implementation, especially regarding the functions and functionalities, so that you do not end up with a technology that is considered as being non-efficient and that doesn't work very well. That is something very important to bear in mind. We will also cover something later on, which means that you have to follow an iterative approach where, in fact, you would start with a few products rather than starting with absolutely everything. And this is also valid on a global basis. You have to look at the most important needs from your clients and start with the distribution channels where the digitalization is most needed and most required for you at that particular time when you need it. So rather than wanting to do everything at once, because especially within the digital sections, it's very difficult to do in parallel many projects at the same time. So think and reflect and think about your strategy, about your products, about your clients' needs, and finally, in the end, think about the technologies that you could apply in order to fulfill that strategy and set up and implement these products. So then we will carry on with the digital ecosystem, what I call the digital ecosystem, as you all have managed to see. I can see you a simplified diagram, or rather simplified pictures of all the elements that are considered as being part of the digital ecosystem. All of these elements, all of these channels that you can see on the left-hand side, online banking, kiosks, the ATM machines, the mobile banking, chatbots, all of these channels are really the entry points for this ecosystem. And once again, as you can see, it's very varied. And once again, this will really depend on your appetite and how you want to position yourself in order to know what amongst these different avenues you want to have or you want to start with. Then, as you can see here on the screen, we have two main elements in the center. One is the back office system, which is often called the core banking system, and the other is the digital banking platform, which in fact will do all the links and links between the different channels and with the central piece of software in order to be able to manage all these new entry points, which are often often not managed by the banking software, and we will talk about this a little later when we'll talk about the software. It's true to say that at the beginning of these central systems, you have a starting point which is quite strong for some subsystems, and once again, we'll talk about this in a little while. As you can see here, there is also another part, another section which covers the payments, simply because this is also quite a new part in this ecosystem with some companies and enterprises which provide some payment services. It has existed for quite a while now with some partners such as Visa and MasterCard, but yet this has increased in a significant manner with insurances and also with some money transfers and international money transfers and so forth. And then also, as we can see here, and this is what we will talk about later on, we can see some systems with some software which are set up around the core banking system, and they will bring much more functionality, many more functions, and it will be either oriented internally, most generally internally, in order to be able to go digital, but also in order to be able to have some operations with other partners, such as here, Switch, which enable the management of the card payment section of it. So really, this was to show you that this system, this ecosystem, is a complex ecosystem with different sections which interact in a very connected manner. So this is very important to consider not only a product or a channel in an isolated manner, but to consider it within its position with the rest of the digital ecosystem, in order to be able to have a digital strategy that could be global, rather than having a digital strategy that could be made up of some of little projects by saying, all right, if we do this, that, and the other, then in this case, if we go for mobile banking, chatbot, and ATM, we're fine, we'll have solved all our problems. But yet, this will not be enough, because you now need to see all the interactions that these digital elements will have between themselves. And of course, you can do this with small projects, but yet you will lose a big part of the synergy that you could benefit from by having this ecosystem, because it's an ecosystem, because there are some interactions between these the various elements. And for example, this could be quite interesting to have a connection and a link between your CRM software and your online banking, or directly with your ATMs. So therefore, you have a number of elements that will be able to interact amongst themselves and have an impact that will be much more interesting for you by having a combination of elements rather than considering these elements as isolated elements.
So now we're going to have a look at these various elements. We're going to start with the data. So in order to launch this discussion, I'm giving you another poll to think about your institution. What are the data in your institution? Is it an element? Is this something which is determined by the informatics department and doesn't really concern you? Is it a crucial element of your new digital strategy? So how this data is structured? Is it something dreadful, a complete headache for creating reports? So for a lot of clients, this is something which is very difficult, and this is because the data are very hard to recover. And is it a resource which needs to be exploited and explored further? So I'm going to leave you answer this poll before continuing. And in the meanwhile, we're going to start to talk about these data. What are these data? Some of you maybe have heard speak of the data and the importance which they can have in the 21st century, because we're going to a world, towards a world which is controlled by data. And even if the data are something which is going to be very important, we need to have a certain amount of structure, organization of these data in order to be able to use them, to look into them and do something with them. So, what I would like to talk about is various elements which were not necessarily obvious concerning these data. So the first, so acquisition, active and silent acquisition. There's two ways of getting data together, one of which is rather obvious. So we ask the client date of birth, his name, where he was born, etc., etc. This is the active acquisition. We ask the client for information which we are going to enter into the system. That was the only type of data which we had access up to date. But with data, we have access to other types of data, which we're calling silent data acquisition. What I want to say with this expression is that we have data which are not given by the user, but are generated by the way in which they use the data. So how many times they connect, how many times they click on something, what are the different parts of such and so, where they've been interested, where they've shown an interest. These are data which is information which is very precious to us. And this does allow you to have an idea of how clients are reacting to your digital products and how they're going to help them. We were thinking about data which are going to have a value. These data are going to have enormous amounts of compared to the silent data, the combination of the two types of data, the active and the silent, is going to give you interesting information, because you're going to be able to do client profiles, make client profiles, particularly with lots of these data. The value is implied by which are developments that are happening in our artificial intelligence. So we can have the results in banking products. I'll give you an example. For those of you who know nanoprêts, these are in fact generated. They have AI motors which are going to engines. We're going to look at mobile money of various clients, are going to generate profiles in order to know if this is a financially reliable client to have. This depends on the various risk management tools which are available, but I've seen engines which looks into your daily activity, who have as friends on Facebook, in order that you can generate a slightly more subtle profile. And this silent acquisition is something which must be considered as being a product. You must already have an idea of the data might be interesting for you. to obtain in order to be acquired. So this is not something which your data manager is not necessarily going to know what's needed, because it's really a vast field, this field of silent data. And it's very important that you should have an idea what are your needs, so that you can talk with your IT specialists to work out what exactly you need to put in place. Another point which really you need to think about when you're creating your data strategy, it's standardization. It's very difficult to standardize the data, particularly if you have various types of software running. And this is something which needs to be considered in depth, because this is going to allow us later on to be able to use these data as in the best possible way. So if this data are standardized, so for example, with a central database which is going to transform your data into a standard format, this is going to allow you to have it's going to you're going to be able to work more, create more generation of data and update them in order to define your strategy as you go. So it's a difficult topic which we don't talk about very much in data strategies, but I think it's important for the future, particularly if you want your data to be used in an optimized way. This comes with another problem, which is the integration, the difficulties for integration. What is integration? In order to talk about how the various softwares are going to work on each other. So how are we going to integrate your data acquisition in the ecosystem of your... And this is done principally through the means of data. So if you have data which are random, not standardized, this could be very complicated. It's very difficult to integrate new elements. And then things become more... We can run your ecosystem more complex.
The last point that you can see on the screen is the gold rush, as talked about that earlier on, and this data will be extremely useful for the artificial intelligence software, which will need to be fed with some data in order to be able to establish the models in question. So therefore, the data that you now have at your disposal, or something that really will be valuable in the future, and it will have some value, especially when organized and when standardized, because when you're dealing with some data that does not have any reference points or organization, these are very difficult to deal with, and therefore their value will decrease significantly. So this was what I had to tell you about the data. I don't know if you have received the results for the second poll question. Apparently, we don't have the results just yet, so we will carry on. And we then will look at the digital channels. I think that this is what interests you most. This is a topic that is very important, and I noticed that it is also critical for many institutions which really are fearful about losing clients simply because they do not have this digital channel set up. And in many cases, this has a serious impact because clients, as we stated earlier on, when we were talking about the digital world, clients now want to carry out their transactions with the devices that they use every day. So it's very important, and therefore we need to see what is really important, but then it's also very complicated. Oftentimes we're dealing with very complicated matters, and especially we have these two aspects, which are the devices themselves on which you connect yourself and the technologies which are being used. For example, in order to do some mobile banking, you can do so in numerous ways and with several different technologies which can be used to that effect. You must have heard about USSD, which enables with a telephone that is not a smartphone, just a very simple telephone, but yet also with SMS. You also have the chatbots now. They will use WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger in order to be able to do some banking. And therefore, these are two different things, the device that you will use and the technology that will be used. So it's important to have these two aspects which become the subject of reflection when you develop your strategy. First of all, define which devices do you want regarding your client's situation. For example, if your clients all have some Nokia phones from the year 2000, then you really shouldn't use some technologies which are developed especially for smartphones. It will not pay much dividend, but rather you can use some simple technologies that can be easily used by the devices that your clients use. However, if your clients, for example, mostly use laptops or PCs, then you can look at internet banking or other elements that you could access via some computers, such as Windows applications, for example, and these kind of things. This then can become quite interesting. But first of all, look at the devices being used by your clients, and then the technologies that will define how these devices will be used. So, this is very important. I have seen many clients which do not necessarily have this particular vision and do not really realize that there are two aspects that need to be looked at separately in order to get the best result. And on that second point, what I want to talk to you about is the choice and how you prioritize this. I've talked to you about this a little earlier. It's very important to choose your priorities and which channels you should set up. I see many institutions who make the mistake of wanting to have all the channels available, to work on all the available channels, and to have a project which, in fact, tries to do everything at once, which is extremely complicated for various reasons. It's extremely complicated because, first of all, managing many projects at the same time is a difficult thing to do, especially the kind of projects where you have similar views, and especially within IT and within the digital world, this adds another layer of complexity, which means that if you set up many pieces of software or many channels at the same time, it will be extremely complicated when you will have a mistake, and mistakes will happen, or whoever you have as an IT person or software seller, they will always tell you that there will not be any problem whatsoever when you will set up your new tools, but yet invariably there will be some problems, and the main aim is to minimize these problems. So when you try to do many things at once and you try to set up many things at once, it gets very complicated when you try to identify the cause and the root of a problem, simply because there are all these new elements appearing at the same time. So therefore, it's very important regarding your client's needs and your technological positioning to identify what or the choices that you want to make. And if you want to go fast, then if you put enough resources on the table in order to have these technologies set up, it's much better to deploy technologies one after the other and try to go fast for each deployment rather than trying to do everything in parallel. And once again, we're coming to the other point that I was mentioning to you a little earlier, which is this iterative approach. Something that I saw once again within digital strategies, where on top of wanting all the channels at the same time, we also want to have all the products on these channels at the same time too. So, for example, we're talking about wanting to have some banking agents which will directly on the first day enable to pay your taxes or enable you to pay your electricity bill and so forth. This is an interesting choice if that is something that you really think is absolutely vital for your clients. But then, in this case, you then will have to cut some other functions off that make the project much too complex for a good implementation. Because when we're talking about the implementation of a new channel, we're talking about some technical problematics that are important aside from the products themselves, in terms of managing communications, etc. And if we add too many products, the problems from the products as well as the technical problems will mean that the number of mistakes, as I said, you will always have some mistakes and errors the day you will deploy and set up these elements. But yet you need to limit such mistakes and errors, and you do so really by reducing the reach of the project with something much more realistic. So, for example, when we are talking about banking agents, the main goal normally when we set up such banking agents is to ensure that clients can have access to their cash. And therefore, the important part is to start with the cash operations. So if you start with the deposits and withdrawals, and this works well, then it's much, much easier once this channel has been set up and is being used by the clients. It's much easier to then add another function and then another function, and then you'll have more time to test it. You will not have the technical problems that will come on top of it all, and you will not have this problem where the client will try something that will not work and abandon this completely. So this iterative approach is important, and the preparation, of course, is indispensable for this project, which once again can also be prejudicial to the institution, simply because if this does not work well, then the reputation of the institution is impacted, and therefore it's very important to prepare these projects accordingly, and not only to give this preparation to the IT person. These are not IT projects. We're talking about commercial projects with an IT component. So therefore, and that's what I always say, I'm an IT person, but I betray my peers, if I may say so. If you give the IT person a problem, your reply will be of a technical nature. If, on the other hand, you want to approach this to solve a commercial problem, a business problem, which is the reason why you have set up these digital channels for a commercial reason or business reason, not a technical one, then you need to have some people who really have this commercial and business aspects within their approach and who use IT as a department that offers a specific technical service. So this is what I had to tell you about the digital channels. And once again, we have a session which unfortunately has a certain amount of time dedicated to it. So therefore, we cannot unfortunately go into details in talking about all the channels. But yet I am trying to give you as many keys as possible. So regarding the software now, a question that I had in mind for you is to you when we are talking about banking software, we're talking about the central banking software. So CIBS and Finaco, Temenos, T24, etc. What are they to you, or do they represent, and are they powerful central banking software to manage all the transactions? So I'm asking you, what does that represent to you today? What is it in your institution today? Are there some innovative softwares given by some young fintechs? Does this represent a very varied offer, difficult to navigate, which I expect is probably the case for a lot of you, or does it represent the obligation to deal with some difficult suppliers? And I expect that you all had some experiences with some very difficult IT suppliers who always come to you with some problems rather than with some solutions to your problems. So I will give you a little while to reply to this question, to this poll question, and then afterwards we will carry on where I will talk to you about this new digital wildlife, digital jungle. What does that include? So the pictures that you have on screen here represent all the fintechs in Africa. I think that it was in 2020. So I think that here we are only talking about fintechs in Africa, and this has increased since, and we have the big names here on the screen. So you can see that the offer is very varied, it's plentiful, and this represents problematic and an issue for these people who decide within the institutions that do not really know what to do with all these offers, which seem very interesting and promise many solutions, but yet they are not necessarily understood within the needs they offer or what to do with this particular solution. So the first point is to not adopt a solution only to meet a need afterwards that we have not yet identified. This is within the same thinking mode that I was telling you earlier on with the part that I was telling you about identifying the client's needs, because I've also seen in my career some institutions that have found a good supplier that had come to introduce them to a product. They found that the product was very interesting, and they want to set up the product without necessarily beforehand having thought about how these products can serve their clients, and they think it's a good idea. The salesperson was good, and therefore we find ourselves with a product that is not necessarily adapted to the institution. The main idea is to define the needs and then afterwards to look for a piece of software or a solution that will meet your needs, because afterwards we'll talk about some software, but some of these softwares are software services, B2B, and they offer some specific services to the institutions, to the banking institutions. So, for example, some services such as risk management or payment services, payment platform, or some services such as banking agents, available banking agents, networks, etc., that kind of thing. So first of all, look at the needs, then the solutions, because the technologies are never or must never be a reply to, or must always be a reply or solution to some existing needs. So what I want to say is that beforehand, the banking software was a software in an institution which was managing everything, and it was the software that everybody had access to in the institution, and any problems had to go through the banking software supplier, and this creates a lot of problems, especially when the banking software was to be migrated. And I think that a lot of you had this experience. That is not necessarily pleasant to migrate the banking software for a long and heavy project and costly project for many institutions. And this model, this all-powerful software model that does absolutely everything, is not really something that is very useful these days. And the reason for that is all these fintechs that present all these new innovations that cannot necessarily be followed by the banking software suppliers who try to add things, but yet it's always difficult when there is a generalist piece of software to then have the same functions or the same capacities that you will have with a very specific piece of software that will, for example, deal with the liquidity transactions or the risk management or the fund management. So, therefore, what happens is that the banking software still exists, but yet it has become more an element that will, in fact, manage the bookkeeping parts, the accounting parts of an institution, and therefore calculates the interest, stock keeping, accounting, and so forth. And then we will have some pieces of software around this in order to solve some specific problems, such as credit requests, such as, for example, risk management. And therefore, and that is why I'm not saying that the software is dead, but generalist pieces of software are not as useful anymore. And this is something, this is a trend that will accelerate because the offer becomes much more plentiful and the needs become much more specialized. And therefore, this will become much more difficult for the banking software providers to be able to follow and offer the same level of functionalities as these smaller companies, which are much more agile with a more specialist offer and specialized offer. So therefore, we're coming back to what I was telling you earlier on, a problem which is a main problem in the digital ecosystem, which is integration. And therefore, if you have many pieces of software, this becomes much more complicated to be able to integrate all these pieces of software together. And this is a problem that has also met some kind of solution with this beginning of the banking software, maybe having less of an important place where we now have middleware, which is a kind of solution that will reside above your banking software and yet interact with it. And it will also interact with all the other elements, whether we're talking about pieces of software or whether we're talking about some external data, such as office credit or the national identification, or whether we're talking about the risk section. All of this will be managed by this middleware, which will also integrate all the different channels and also will be able to have some much more complex interactions, as its specialty is to manage these interactions and generate some complex interactions between various channels that will interact amongst themselves, and this will give you much stronger flexibility in order to be able to implement some tools that are really specific to what you really need at one particular time or another. And the last point that I want to talk to you about are the advantages of the partnership. So, as I stated many times, we now have many companies, many enterprises, B2B enterprises, B2B companies who offer some services to financial institutions, which will be services that will not really be, well, there will be new services that were not taken up on time necessarily in some countries by the banks, and therefore they made the implementation of digital channels very difficult. For example, one example I can give you that has been present for a long time is the example of the telephony aggregators. So, therefore, it was very difficult beforehand for an institution to be able to connect itself with some mobile providers, and they really needed each time to start some complicated negotiations with each operator in order to be able to set up this connection and to get access to some services such as USSD, such as being able to do some transfers with mobile wallets and this kind of things. So this was complicated. This needed quite a long time, but in many countries now we have some companies. They are called aggregators, and they're already connected with all the mobile providers, and they will be able to give you an interface with all of these mobile providers all at once. So therefore, you just access them, and they will then supply you with something that is normalized, standardized, that will be very easily integrated by your software, and then they will be in charge of establishing the connection with all of the other mobile providers in order to be able to enable you to carry out all these various operations such as USSD and such as SMS banking and so forth. So this is just one example of this kind of enterprises and companies, but you then have some enterprises or companies which will enable you to have access to chatbots. We also have some companies that will enable you to get access to some payment platforms. And what I want to say is that it's important to have some partnership relationships with these companies because they will provide you with some access to technology, and you will then need to have the same outlook to see which way will this evolve towards. And then you also need some kind of stability because, as I was saying earlier on, these technical elements which are in fact difficult and which will probably have some problems to start with. If you have to change supplier each time, you will then repeat these technical problems time and time again. So, by creating a partnership with these companies, or for example, with a company that will provide you some middleware, as I was saying earlier on, this will enable you to have a technological partner that will enable you to move forward without needing to repeat all the sections where the supplier learns about you, as well as the technical part where you have the difficult aspects to deal with. So this was what I wanted to address you on. So the main messages that I wanted to mention to you are really to not consider the digital world simply as being a technical trend or simply and only based on new technologies and some mobile applications, but rather this is something that is absolutely essential, and you need to change the way you look at your institutions. And this digital world must not be something that you add on, but rather something that springs from your own identity as an institution. And if you look at your own identity, in fact, the technology will naturally come to you, and you will naturally know which technology is really useful to you in order to have the best possible results that will correspond most with the path forward that you want to go on as an institution. And I also try to give you some elements as to how this digital world works and interacted, what are the important elements with the data that are very much the backbone of this digitalization, which we do not talk a lot about, but yet it will play a very important role in the future. So the sooner you look at this aspect and the more prepared you will be. As for the digital channels, these are an essential element that is part of your daily life these days, and these will carry on having capital importance, essential importance for advancing in the digital world with some agencies that are still important, but they will not play such a big role. You will deal with the smaller agencies which will meet some more specific needs. And finally, the digital wildlife, the digital jungle, with all these software providers and service providers. I'm certain that you receive regular emails or regular LinkedIn messages from them trying to sell you some products. It's very difficult to navigate through that. But once again, I think that the main way to manage this particular section is to look at what you need, what you want, where do you want to go with your institution, and then you can search for what you're after, and you will then find easily some people that will then be able to offer some solutions that will be tailored to your problems. So we will now move towards, unless I've forgotten anything, many thanks for your attention. First of all, we'll now move towards the question and answer sessions. Yes, many thanks, Christophe, for this enriching presentation, and also for this digital finance guide, which I'm sure will be very useful to our participants. Just before we start with the questions and answers, let me just remind you about something. The PDF from this presentation and also the recording of this session will be available on the program's website at www.msmeta.eu. So I invite you to go there in order to have access to all the resources, and also many thanks to the participants who have already sent us some questions. I think that we can start with the following question. A participant is asking, what is your advice for a partnership with a fintech regarding implementation of a digital option? What are the main stages to think about in this partnership? Many thanks for this question. This is a very interesting question indeed. As I was saying, I often advise my clients to set up a partnership, and we have different elements to keep in mind. One of the elements which I think is very important is the knowledge by this partner of your business. If it's not the same thing, if, for example, you're a microfinance company and they're used to dealing with big banks such as Société Générale or one of such banks, of course, it will be more complicated because they do not have a detailed knowledge of your operations, and unless you internally have some people with the dual IT and business capacities, it would be very complicated and very difficult to have some discussions with them, and this will lead to a lot of misunderstandings, which will lead to the project not working very well. Another point to bear in mind is to really be aware of the planning implementations when you set up this partnership, knowing that what often happens to me is that the institutions push towards shorter time frames and pushing that way a lot of companies which will end up accepting whilst knowing that this will not be finished on time. So you need to put some pressure on in order to have some shorter time frames, but knowing that even something that seems simple on a business level is not necessarily something that will be simple in terms of how it can be implemented. Now, on the contractual level, you also need to beware the fact that many costs were changed from investment costs to operational costs, but yet you really need to look at the volume that you intend to have, what will be the exact costs, and do you really want to go for it? Or rather, what about if you do not have the investment, but yet you have much more important operational expenses. This is something to bear in mind. And yet, the main message is take your time. Take your time to choose your partners wisely, because we are talking about partnerships that will be long-term partnerships that will have an impact on the way in which you interact with your clients. And therefore, I see many institutions which are pushed by some kind of urgency, emergency, thinking, yes, we really must go digital, but yet you really need to take the time to have the good solutions. And I hope that this answers the question accordingly. Many thanks, Christophe. I think that it also answers another question that we have received regarding partnerships. That question is in English, and I will say it in French. What are the risks associated to a partnership with an electronic money company with which we are linked in order to distribute some digital financial services? So I am already underlining the different stages and so forth. I don't know if you have anything else to add. Well, yes, when you enter a partnership, you always have a potential risk associated with this, which is why I say please take the time to choose your partners wisely. And it's the same thing for this question, and even more so knowing that, as for myself, I often advise the institutions, especially the small-sized institutions, that rather than trying to establish themselves some networks of agents, this can be quite complex, or some electronic portfolios by themselves, but rather to look at whether it would be more interesting maybe for them to have a partnership with an electronic money provider, because this will really reduce their costs that they would have to generate for this kind of project, but especially this will enable them to be operational quite quickly, because the agent's network is already in place, whilst trying to set up an agent network by yourself is a very complicated thing. So these suppliers, these mobile suppliers, mobile providers already have some well-established networks, solid networks, and therefore this is something that I really recommend. But once again, as was mentioned in the question, there are some associated risks. There are some safety and security risks. But once again, if you choose your partner wisely, this will really help you on a long-term basis. But please do not hesitate too much in the way that this is something now that mobile suppliers offer, almost all of them, and then the balance will go very quickly towards these institutions, trying to find some banks who to work with them rather than the other way around, which means that there will be some kind of competition, which means that the level of service offered will be improved in any case. So I think that, yes, there are some risks, but there are also some risks when you want to do this by yourself, because your IT service, your IT department, is not necessarily an expert in this matter, and oftentimes there is what I've seen, and I'll give that message as an IT person. For many people who are not involved in IT, IT is one kind of monolithic thing, but yet over the last 20 years, IT has changed enormously. And the IT engineer who's part of the development team, and the IT engineer who repairs your computer, or who makes sure that you can get access to internet, have radically different activities and radically different jobs. And therefore, it's not that your IT will be properly specialized and sufficiently informed in order to set up some products such as mobile wallet or that kind of thing. So I will also add something else that is very important. I've spoken a little about this earlier on, but I was saying that it's not necessarily the case that you have some people in your institution who know information technology and the business, and therefore I'm encouraging all institutions to have some people within the institution who will have these dual skills and therefore who will know the technical part of the information technology, not necessarily in detail, but at least overall, and who will also know the business side of it, because these people are those who will be able to be the driver for your digital evolution, because they will be able to give you this good overview for these problematics that are dual problematics in that sense. I hope that even if I've added some elements, I hope that this answered the question accordingly, because these topics are important to me. Many thanks for this, Christophe. Another very specific question again. What digital channels can you set up at a low cost for microfinance institutions? Do you have any advice for this particular cases? Yes, totally. As I stated earlier on, this will also depend on the devices. Generally, for group credit, we're talking about developing countries with smartphone penetration levels that are quite low. And therefore, in this case, to me, one of the solutions that I often recommend is that generally most consultants will avoid giving you some ready-made solutions. So, of course, I will nevertheless mention that to you, but yet please bear a caveat in mind that because it will depend on your situation. But to me, on a topic such as microfinance towards some groups, therefore USSD is something that works very well. And as for payments made by mobile wallet, this is something that also works very well with using some mobile suppliers and mobile providers. And also, do not hesitate. I think this is something where I work with some institutions who work with such groups. Please do not hesitate to add some functions or some services for your group so that they can manage these, maybe not banking services as such, but they will therefore be able to help the groups to manage internally how they function and how they run, because this will generate much more cohesion within the groups. And one of the main problems with digitalization for the groups is the fact that the groups do not necessarily need to meet. And therefore, this means that the group is much less homogeneous and doesn't last so long in terms of time frame, and therefore the arrears might increase because of that, because the group does not feel the same level of solidarity. So therefore, please don't hesitate once again to start with the simplest thing, which is the repaying of credits and so forth. But once you have reached that level, please don't hesitate to offer some services to the group that are services that will enable them to manage themselves internally and maybe to manage their cash parts or the meetings, the group meetings and so forth. So I've talked about SSD and I've talked about mobile wallets, and I will add something else, which is a product that is really trendy now, which is not that costly to set up and implement. We're talking about a chatbot through WhatsApp, through Facebook Messenger, and this necessitates a certain level of smartphone penetration level, but yet in terms of cost, in terms of implementation, and in terms of speed of implementation and speed of deployment, this is something that is really one of the best things these days in terms of mobile. That's great. Many thanks. We have another question, which is how can we digitalize risk management in a microfinance institution? Okay, this is a pretty wide question. All right, okay, we have different models. So, for example, I was talking about the nano loans earlier on. We have some institutions, and I think that the name is Jubo in Ghana, if I'm not mistaken, and they can provide you with some risk management services with some caseload analysis with artificial intelligence or something that is totally automated, which will enable to grant some credits very quickly, but generally at a low level. And in any case, with anything that deals with risk management, you have to be aware of the fact that whoever takes that risk is therefore the provider of the solution that will manage your risk. They must necessarily have a certain risk themselves for this risk calculation in order to have that particular motivation to do the best job possible, if I may say so that you do not find yourself with all the risk on your side. So what I was saying about the nano loans, I was talking about solutions such as Jubo, for example, and now we also have other solutions which are based on some models, and these are models based on artificial intelligence or something quite new. I think that we need to bear that in mind and be cautious because it's quite difficult to control the appetite for risk on these types of software, and it's not always obvious to see why some cases were declined and why some cases were accepted, because the artificial intelligence will not give this kind of replies. It will just react to some models and some archetypes and patterns that were set up for the clients. The other way to go forward is with modelization and with different patterns. So therefore, we're talking about some providers and suppliers who are already in place. I don't have any names in mind, but they provide different models, different patterns, and therefore they will consider your risk strategy and they will modelize this in order to generate regarding certain elements that have been identified in order to be able to generate some kind of scoring notes for the credit records, and therefore they will enable you to either automatize or support and help in the decision making. My own personal opinion is that a model or a template is never perfect, and a model always needs a human intervention. To me, I see this kind of modelization much more like something that comes as a support to the decision made by the credit agents or the credit committees, rather than something which will completely replace and automate completely your portfolio and your payments and disbursements, aside from these small credits where you can enable yourself to have a level of arrears that is bigger because they're also much more profitable. So it's also a matter of positioning with this kind of products. Are you really interested in that kind of products or not? So you have these two different aspects, the artificial intelligence aspect and the modelization aspect, which will enable you to manage that risk in the sense that you will be able to analyze that risk, and then you have the whole digitalization part of the process itself, which will also, in a way, manage your risks or certainly reduce your risk, but it will also enable you to have much more information. And what I often see with a lot of clients is the non-digitalization of credit requests. So we record the credits in the main system only when the credit is disbursed or when the credit has been reviewed by a credit committee, which is a shame in a way because you lose a lot of information on what kind of request you receive, what kind of request you decline before the credit committee. And therefore, this gives you quite an artificial view of your risk management because you feel that you manage risk through what goes through the credit committee, whilst in fact there are many more requests that are declined at a previous level. So the digitalization of the credit process, I would say, is also part of risk management. And for that, if you have the right digital maturity, and it's something that maybe I should have talked to you about, but then again, we had so many topics to cover. So the projects that you could take on within your digitalization will also depend on your own maturity. Where are you at in terms of your digitalization of internal processes, in terms of the distribution channels, in terms of your agencies, in terms of your equipment for your agents? This will define where you can go from there when you develop your strategy. So this is also part of your technological positioning. It's also a positioning of where you are now and where you want to go. And therefore, if this particular part is not digitalized, I think that this is also something that is very important before you even start considering an automated risk management or other automated processes. It's to have the whole process automated automatically, so that when you set up a risk management as an automated session, this could be automatized directly and automatically, because for a problem to work, you need to have some standardized information, as I've mentioned earlier on, regarding the data, and you need to have this completely digitalized for that to be absorbed by the model in order for that model to do its calculation. And I hope that this answers this quite complicated question accordingly. Absolutely. Many thanks for this. We have many more questions, so many thanks to all our participants for these very good questions. One of these questions is as follows. As digitalization is an essential element, what place does connectivity must have with the network? And the participant also explains that we're talking about digitalization whilst we know that the different speeds of evolution are very different. Yes, this is what I was saying earlier on with regarding the maturity of an institution. So when we talk about connectivity and connections, we really talk about the foundations. This is almost impossible to go for an advanced digitalization process with some connections and that are not to be trusted, because so therefore we always have some means to manage with some offline methods and so forth. There are always ways to have some elements that will enable you to support some connections breakdowns. But however, if you do not have a stable connection, then this will present a huge problem for everything I was mentioning earlier on, for the overview. If, for example, you have an ATM and each time your clients go to this ATM, it doesn't work because it's online, well, they will then maybe go 2 or 3 times there, and then they will stop using your ATMs simply because they know that they don't work. So, before anything else, the first investment that needs to be done, I know it's very difficult for many institutions, simply because these are some technical problems, complex problems, but it's really the minimum to be able to operate with the digital world before you even invest in some very costly elements. You really need to have a certain level of trust with this in order to be able to move forward with the digitalization. I know that is not necessarily the reply that people expect from me, but yes, this is something that is part of the minimum and necessary investments. Saying that, as I was saying earlier on when I was talking about partnerships, these days in many countries now, and especially in Africa, I know that we have many people in Africa, and I can see here in Benin right now, where I am right now, with a very good connection. So there are many companies now that provide some private networks at the country level, and this will enable you to not have to support a whole internal network infrastructure by yourself, and therefore necessitating some important technical capacity to ensure that everything works well. So therefore, this will be something that will enable you to connect yourself directly to a level of expertise that is high and a level of operational functionality that is much more important than what you can do by yourself. And as we are talking about the partner with whom you have agreed on certain levels of availability, you will therefore have a system that will be very motivating for them in order to keep these levels high, and this will then increase your capacity with the interconnectivity and interconnection in quite significant manner. So what I will say on that topic is this: don't try to do everything yourself. Look at the suppliers and providers available in your country that provide some network connection at the country level, and from then on you will be able to have a connection that works quite well. But it's true that it's costly. I know that it's a problem for many. Yes, that's right. Many thanks, Christophe. I think that maybe we have the time to maybe take only 2 more questions. One participant is asking us what are the steps that you would recommend in order to adopt a new product that seems indispensable for the market in which you operate. So as I was saying earlier on, first of all, in order to identify the client's needs, in order to know what products they could put and place on that new channel, and what elements of the product they could implement to start with, because once again, and I'm repeating myself quite a lot, but I will do so once again, do not try to have everything from day one, but please start with some limited functions and functionalities. This will work very well straight away, or much better straight away, rather than having too large an offer, which oftentimes does not reflect what your client needs. Normally, on the digital products, you have a main way to look at it, which is to get access to this financial service, for example, and therefore that is what you need to focus on. Once this is in place, and once you have solved all the technical problems that you will encounter no matter what, and no matter what you're told, once you will have solved these technical problems and you will have set up these product elements or the simple elements in place, now it will be time to look at and move forward and develop further, and this will also enable you to have much more clients' feedback, and you will see how the clients use your products or the networks, and what will the next step be, and the most interesting next step for you. That's great. Many thanks for reminding us of these steps, and I will maybe take one last question for 1 minute. What kind of a communication for digital success? I know that we have all talked about this, but I'm wondering if you have some advice about this. Well, I'm not a communication or marketing specialist, but what I saw with the institutions with whom I worked is that generally clients are very eager to adopt new technologies or new products, but yet they are also very inconstant. They lack consistency, as there are a lot of new technologies being put forward. The client will hesitate, and this is what I stated earlier on. If you start directly and it doesn't function well, the client will go and not come back. So, to me, the best communication you can have is really to have a product that works very well and that does not have many technical problems. And then afterwards, if you offer a product that is really meeting the needs from your clients that are not supplied for, then communication will develop by itself. We are talking mostly about Africa, and I will talk about Africa. This is a continent I know best, and most of the communication is from mouth to mouth, and therefore, or word of mouth rather, and therefore, this is the quality of the service and the fact that it meets a specific need from the clients, which by meeting that client's needs, you will be able to have a product that works very well. Now, in terms of the commercial side of it and how to sell this, I cannot really help you much in that area, I'm afraid. That's not really my forte. I'm not really involved in the marketing side of it, but I would say that as for my own point of view as a digital expert, make certain that your product works well and that it meets the client's needs, and then the clients will keep coming. Well, many thanks for this approach. We'll say that we can maybe take the last minute to thank our participants for their active participation today with their questions. And I'm sorry that I could not take all the questions. Many thanks, Christophe, for this excellent presentation. Many thanks. Many thanks to you. And I wish you once again a very good day. And many thanks for having been with us for this session today. Many thanks to you all for having listened to us. And I hope that this presentation was useful to you and will turn out to be useful to you. Thank you.